The FIFA World Cup is one of the largest global sporting events, bringing together millions of travellers across multiple countries. But alongside the scale of the event comes a more complex risk environment, from crime and cyber threats to protest activity and geopolitical tensions. Large-scale sporting events can amplify existing risks while introducing new ones. What does this mean for those travelling to and operating around the World Cup in 2026? To explore this, here's our intelligence analyst, Manfredi Pozzoli.
Just to give a brief introduction about the World Cup, it is arguably the largest sporting event in the world. It's usually watched by slightly less of half of the world's population, so viewership that is counted in the billions. And this edition, which will take place between the 11th of June and the 19th of July, is billed as the largest ever. It will take place across 3 countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico, and we will have 48 teams participating, 60 more than the previous total of 32, for a total of 104 matches. Early estimates assess that the 6.5 million people will visit the 16 cities hosting World Cup games during the event. Now, of course, Canada, the US, and Mexico are 3 very different countries. We assess Canada to be overall a low-risk destination, the US to be a moderate-risk destination, and Mexico to be a moderate to high-risk destination, depending on the city. But there are some baseline threats that are shared or will be affected by the World Cup in different ways across the 3 countries. So starting with crime is probably the threat that most travelers will be most concerned about. There are statistical studies that indicate a strong correlation between petty and opportunistic crime and other property offenses and large-scale sporting events. So this is definitely something that we will see as a major threat at the host cities during the event. However, we are observing in the last few years differentiation in terms of the type of property crimes, especially associated with these events. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen, for example, a rise in luxury property crimes that often target high net worth individuals. Criminals, for example, will conduct scouting ahead of targeting their victims, using, for example, their social media footprints ahead of targeting them in order to target fewer victims but obtain considerably larger monetary income from their thefts. Of course, because we're talking about the World Cup and participation and booking will include online procedures, cybercrime is likely to be one of the major threats associated with traveling to the World Cup. Canadian authorities in late 2025 already identified more than 4,000 spoofed domains tending to be associated with official World Cup channels, but then are used to install malware or steal information from victims. Related to cybercrime, there's this growing threat from AI. AI can be used by cyber criminals, for example, to increase the volume of personalized phishing emails or other forms of cyber threats that can target attendees. And finally, the World Cup occurs at a time where the organized crime landscape is changing considerably, especially in Mexico. Mexican cartels are under extreme pressure from both the Mexican and US governments, which have notably culminated in February with the killing of El Mencho, the leader of the CJNG, which is arguably the largest cartel in Mexico, but also because of the splintering of the Sinaloa cartel, which is the other major cartel in Mexico. So all of these factors are likely to create very complex and changing crime threat landscape during the events. The second major threat category that I'd like to talk about is civil unrest. Because of the high exposure that is associated with the World Cup and other events, they tend to attract large-scale protests as well as smaller protests carried out by activist groups. There are several drivers: foreign policy, and we'll talk about geopolitics later, I'm sure, but also domestic developments within the host countries. For example, in the US, the World Cup happens just a few months before the crucial midterms vote in November, whereas in Mexico, the World Cup happens at a time where the cost of living crisis has driven considerable civil unrest. We can think about the last year's anti-expat protest that took place in the summer in Mexico City and at times even turned violent. Of course, this is pertaining to large-scale protests, but we can also think about small-scale protests and actions meant to disrupt the World Cup itself. This is something that could mirror what we've seen before the Olympics in France, where groups that were opposed to the Olympics staged several actions of sabotage to try and disrupt the events. We're already seeing something like this in the sense that there are several groups opposing the World Cup that are staging, for now, small-scale localized protests meant to disrupt the events or the preparations for the event. An example of this would be the Anti-World Cup Days, which is a weekly protest going on in Mexico City, during which one of the main highways next to the stadium is being blockaded. There are, of course, other protest vectors. including, for example, environment-related issues or other more long-standing trends in protests. For example, we can think of the university campuses protest against the war in Gaza, which have been observed in the US and Canada especially. A final kinetic threat that I would like to talk about is terrorism. Again, precisely because of the extremely large viewership of the World Cup, it is a very desirable target for terrorist groups that often seek to maximize exposure for their actions. The major threat will likely come from Islamist jihadist groups. For example, the Islamic State has called on supporters to target large-scale events in the past. This has included the recent Paris Olympics, but as well as the World Cup in Russia in 2018. In addition to Islamist terrorism, when it comes to the Islamic State, there have been cases of the Islamic State targeting large-scale events. We can just think about the bombing attacks in Paris in 2015. Other ideologically motivated forms of extremism that might affect the World Cup or might target the World Cup include both far-right and far-left groups. However, I would like to point out an emerging terrorism threat, which is non-ideological terrorism. This is sometimes called by the FBI as nihilistic violent extremism, and it's really a trend that has appeared over the past 2 or 3 years of perpetrators, often extremely young, that carry out attacks just for the sake of obtaining exposure without reference to any specific ideology. And this form of terrorism is particularly associated with English-speaking countries, and therefore the US and Canada. However, Mexico and non-English speaking countries are increasingly more exposed. We can think about the terrorist attack that happened at an archaeological site in Mexico, which was likely an example of this nihilistic violent extremism, which therefore cannot be ruled out in non-English speaking countries. The current Iran conflict is likely to impact the World Cup, for example, by driving civil unrest in opposition, for example, to the US military involvement in the Middle East, but also in different ways. As of now, it is still unclear if the Iranian team, which has qualified for the World Cup, will attend. But if it does, its opening match is scheduled to happen in Los Angeles, which is a city that has about 700,000 members of the Iranian diaspora, which is the largest Iranian diaspora in the world. And this diaspora community has staged several protests in opposition to the Iranian regime. And it is highly likely that if the Iran team goes in place in Los Angeles, this will induce civil unrest to occur. This also matters for what we could call geopolitically charged games. There is a threat of hooliganism and fun-driven violence at the World Cup. Several other geopolitical developments are likely to be influential, even though we talk about them less compared to Iran. This obviously includes the ongoing war in Ukraine. Russia, for example, staged several cyber attacks on previous large-scale events. The most notable one is the 2018 Olympic destroyer attack that targeted the South Korean Winter Olympics, which was likely, according to US analysts, a Russian-backed attack made to look like a North Korean attack. But also, in addition to Russia, there are several developments in the Western Hemisphere that could affect the threat landscape during the World Cup. For example, this includes the January US operation that captured Nicolas Maduro and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Cuba, which, because of the large diasporas from those countries present across the host countries, could drive civil unrest and potentially forms of political violence.
That was Manfredi Pozzoli sharing insight from our latest Global Risk Outlook webinar. For further information, including detailed analysis and practical guidance for travellers and organisations travelling to and operating around the tournament, you can read the full travel risk advisory on our website at solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.